128 megabytes. There was a time when 128 megabytes of VRAM wasn't painfully outdated. It was premium. Early 2000s premium. Looking at a 128 megabyte card next to a 24 gigabyte monster tells the whole story. One is a relic of a simpler time, the other is a workstation powerhouse. And just like the physical cards, the experience gap between them is massive. Back when Windows XP felt unstoppable and your monitor weighed more than your PC, 128 megabyte graphic cards like the GeForce 4 Ti and Radeon 9000 series were serious upgrades. You didn't ask how much VRAM it had. If it said 128 MB on the box, you nodded respectfully. VRAM, or Video Random Access Memory, is your GPU's short-term memory. It stores textures, shadows, frame buffers, basically everything the graphics card needs right now. The more detail a game has, the more memory it chews through like it skipped breakfast. And just to be clear, VRAM is completely separate from your system RAM. Your system RAM handles the operating system and apps. VRAM handles everything visual. They don't share, they don't swap, and they're not interchangeable. That's why a PC can have 16 gigabytes of system RAM and still struggle if the GPU only has 2 gigabytes of VRAM. With 128 megabytes, games ran comfortably at 800 by 600 or maybe 1024 by 768 if you were feeling brave. Textures looked decent, as long as you didn't stand too close. Anti-aliasing? That was for rich kids. Shadows? Optional. Reflections? Let's not get greedy. But games like Counter-Strike 1.6, Warcraft 3, and GTA Vice City ran smoothly. And that's what mattered. You weren't counting pixels, you were having fun. Then developers discovered high-resolution textures. Suddenly 128 megabytes wasn't cruising, it was gasping for air. The moment VRAM filled up, your GPU borrowed system RAM, and performance dropped faster than your frames per second in a smoke grenade. 512 MB. If 128 MB was survival mode, 512 MB was confidence. That was the, okay, now we're gaming era. Around the mid to late 2000s, cards like the GeForce 8800 GT and Radeon HD 4850 made 512 megabytes the sweet spot. And suddenly games didn't just run. They looked good doing it. Resolutions climbed to 1280 by 1024 and 1680 by 1050. Textures got sharper. Shadows stopped looking like blurry puddles. Anti-aliasing became usable instead of a performance death sentence. For the first time, you could turn settings to high without your PC sounding like it was filing for bankruptcy. VRAM demand was rising fast though. Developers were discovering open worlds, detailed character models, and something called realistic lighting. Games like Crysis showed up and basically said, nice GPU, shame if something happened to it. With 512 megabytes, most titles ran smoothly at medium to high settings, as long as you respected your limits. Push to ultra textures, and you'd start seeing stutters. When VRAM fills up, the GPU starts swapping data with system memory, and that's when gameplay turns into a PowerPoint presentation. But 512 MB hit a cultural sweet spot. This was the peak LAN party era. Steam was exploding. PC gaming felt unstoppable. Today, 512 megabytes wouldn't survive the loading screen of a modern AAA title. Even indie games might bully it. But back then, it was the moment PC gamers stopped lowering settings by default and started raising them. 1 gigabyte. 1 gigabyte of VRAM wasn't just an upgrade, it was reassurance. Around 2008 to 2012, cards like the GeForce GTX 460 and Radeon HD 6870 made 1 gigabyte the new standard. And suddenly, 1080p gaming wasn't a dream anymore. It was happening, on your desk, without smoke coming out of the case. Textures got sharper, open worlds got bigger, draw distances stretched farther than your patience in a patch download. Games like Skyrim, Battlefield 3, and GTA 4 looked dramatically better than the generation before. And for the first time, high settings felt realistic, not reckless. At 1920 by 1080 resolution, 1 gigabyte was comfortable, mostly. As long as you didn't go wild with ultra textures or heavy mods, performance stayed smooth. But crank everything to max, especially in newer titles, and that 1 GB buffer filled up fast. Once VRAM overflowed, stuttering showed up like an uninvited guest. This was also the era when texture packs became popular. Install a high-res mod, and suddenly your proud 1 gigabyte card started sweating like it just saw Crysis in the taskbar. 2 gigabytes. 2 gigabytes was the moment VRAM stopped being generous and started being tested. By the early 2010s, game developers were done playing nice. Open worlds were expanding, textures were getting sharper, and lighting engines were flexing harder than your GPU fan curve. Cards like the GeForce GTX 760, GTX 960, and Radeon R9 270 made 2 GB the mainstream standard. And for a while, it felt perfect. At 1080p resolution, the 2 GB handled high settings comfortably. Frame rates were stable. Worlds felt detailed. You could finally click high without immediately regretting your life choices. But this was also when ultra settings became dangerous territory. Games like GTA 5, Far Cry 4, and The Witcher 3 could run smoothly until you maxed out texture quality. That's when VRAM usage quietly crossed the 2 GB line. And once that happened, performance didn't explode dramatically. It just stumbled. Small stutters when turning the camera, tiny freezes when loading new areas. Enough to remind you that limits exist. 1440p monitors also started gaining popularity during this era, and at that resolution, 2 GB wasn't thriving. It was negotiating terms. Still, 2 GB lasted longer than anyone expected. It powered budget and mid-range PCs for years and held the line through a surprisingly demanding generation of games. 4 GB. 4 GB of VRAM was the era when you could finally stop worrying about every graphical option. It wasn't untouchable, but it felt like a luxury you didn't have to justify. Around 2014 to 2017, GPUs like the GeForce GTX 970, GTX 1050 Ti, and Radeon RX 480 made 4 GB mainstream for mid to high-end gaming. Of course, 4 GB came with its most infamous controversy. The GTX 970 was advertised as having 4 GB, but only 3.5 ran at full speed. The remaining half gig operated significantly slower, causing stutters when games pushed past the 3.5 GB line. NVIDIA faced a class action lawsuit over it. It wasn't a deal breaker for most people at 1080p, but it taught an entire generation of gamers to read the fine print on VRAM specs. Controversy aside, 1080p gaming on ultra settings wasn't a dare anymore, it was the expectation. Textures could be crisp, shadows detailed, and anti-aliasing could actually work without turning your game into a slideshow. This was also the time 1440p monitors became more common. At this resolution, 4 GB was comfortable for most titles, though some AAA games started nudging past that limit. VRAM-heavy features like heavy resolution texture packs, dense foliage, and realistic lighting could stress the card, but the system usually survived without stutters, most of the time. Games like The Witcher 3, Fallout 4, and GTA 5 ran beautifully, giving players cinematic worlds with fewer compromises. Streaming, recording gameplay, and running mods all became feasible without constant worry about hitting a VRAM ceiling. Of course, 4 GB wasn't invincible. Ultra textures at 1440p could still make the GPU grumble. And as 4K monitors and VR setups started creeping into the mainstream, 4 GB quickly shifted from luxury to adequate. Quick question, which VRAM size was your first GPU? Drop it in the comments. And if you're finally understanding what these numbers actually mean, hit the like button. It genuinely helps the channel. 8 GB. 8 GB of VRAM was the point where high settings stopped being a suggestion and started being a rule. This wasn't just playable. This was bring everything to ultra and laugh at stuttering. By the late 2010s, GPUs like the GeForce GTX 1070, RTX 2060 Super, and Radeon RX 580 made 8 GB the sweet spot for serious 1080p and 1440p gaming. This was also the era where VRAM types started mattering. Earlier cards used GDDR3 or GDDR5, but by this generation, GDDR6 was becoming the standard. Faster bandwidth, lower power consumption, and better performance per gigabyte. The amount of VRAM is important, but so is the type. 8 GB of GDDR6 runs circles around 8 GB of GDDR5 in the same workload. Suddenly, texture packs, realistic shadows, dense foliage, and even anti-aliasing weren't threats. They were expected. Games could look gorgeous without your GPU begging for mercy. At 1440p, 8 GB handled practically everything. Even demanding titles like Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Red Dead Redemption 2, and Cyberpunk 2077 ran beautifully, mostly. Push to 4K and VRAM started working overtime, but 8 GB still kept the experience smooth enough that you could complain about bugs instead of frame drops. This was also the era when mods exploded. High-resolution texture mods, ENB enhancements, and massive open-world expansions suddenly felt feasible without stuttering. Streaming and recording at the same time? No problem. 8 GB made your rig feel like it could do anything. Of course, nothing is perfect. Certain 4K textures, ultra settings, or massive simulation games could still push 8 GB close to its limit. But for the majority of gamers, it was a safety net that let you forget about VRAM entirely. 16 GB. 16 GB of VRAM is where things start feeling like overkill. Until you actually need it. This isn't your average gamer territory. This is the let's render entire cities, stream at max settings, and pretend we're not hitting a professional workflow zone. Around 2018 onward, GPUs like the NVIDIA RTX 4080, AMD Radeon RX 6800 XT, and AMD Radeon RX 7800 XT made 16 GB a reality for enthusiasts, for content creators, and pros. At 4K resolution, ultra settings, ray tracing, and heavy mods, 16 GB could handle it without flinching. VRAM suddenly stopped being the bottleneck. Your imagination became the limit. Modern AAA titles love textures, shadows, reflections, particle effects, and detailed worlds. With 16 GB, you could max all of them while streaming, recording, and running background apps without even blinking. Games like Cyberpunk 2077, Microsoft Flight Simulator, and Red Dead Redemption 2 were playable in all their glory, assuming your CPU and storage kept up. For content creators, this was a game changer. 3D rendering, complex simulations, AI training, and video editing at ultra resolution suddenly became feasible on consumer hardware. Your GPU wasn't just for gaming anymore. It became a workstation. Of course, it's still not magic. Certain professional workloads and experimental AI models can eat 16 GB like it's popcorn. And for most average gamers at 1080p or even 1440p, 16 GB is a luxurious overkill. 24 GB. 24 GB of VRAM isn't for most gamers. Heck, it's barely for most humans. This is the hold my coffee while I render an entire digital city at 8K with ray tracing and AI-enhanced textures level of memory. Cards like the NVIDIA RTX 4090 and professional workstation GPUs pushed 24 GB into reality, and with the RTX 5090 now carrying the torch, 24 GB has become the flagship standard, the number that separates enthusiasts from professional in NVIDIA's lineup. At 4K, laughable overkill. At 8K, still not enough in some extreme cases. And in content creation, AI training, or complex simulations, 24 GB feels downright necessary. Finally, a number that keeps up with ambition instead of holding it back. At this scale, games aren't limited by VRAM at all. Every texture, shadow, particle effect, and lighting pass can load fully in memory. Ultra mods? Easy. Ray tracing with DLSS 3? Smooth. Multiple 4K monitors or streaming while running demanding apps? Child's play. Your GPU stops being a gaming card and becomes a literal workstation on steroids. The reality check. Most people don't need this much. Even at 4K gaming, 16 GB is plenty. 24 GB is future-proofing on a ridiculous scale, a luxury for those who refuse to compromise or for professionals running massive workloads. Think AI model training, cinematic rendering, or simulations that make even high-end PCs sweat. Still, for enthusiasts and pros, 24 GB is the ultimate freedom. It's the VRAM equivalent of a private jet. You probably don't need it, but oh, the places you can go. That's VRAM from 128 MB bricks to 24 GB titans. Each size fixed the last one's limits and let games, mods, and creative work get bigger and sharper. Which VRAM size did you grow up with? Squeezing textures on 512 MB? Hitting Ultra on 4 GB? Or flexing 16 GB like a pro? Drop it in the comments. If this cleared up the VRAM confusion, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, here's the thing. You just learned about the memory inside your graphics card, but there's another spec you see on every device you own that's just as confusing. Bluetooth 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, 5.0, 6.0. What do any of these actually mean? Why do some devices connect instantly while others drop signal every 5 seconds? And is upgrading to the latest version even worth it? That's exactly what we're covering next. Every Bluetooth version explains simply what each one changed, which one you're probably using, and why the older versions were so painfully unreliable. Click the video on screen right now, and I'll see you there.